The Second World War is remembered as a war of liberation, of sacrifice, and of triumphant Allied unity. Yet beneath the speeches, the parades, and the carefully curated victory photographs lies another archive. An archive not meant for the eyes of civilians, not meant for classrooms, not meant for remembrance ceremonies. These are the files marked with heavy red stamps, classified, restricted, forbidden. They describe choices that contradicted the noble story of liberation. They reveal leaders who bargained away allies, who sanctioned experiments in secret, who redrew maps while populations screamed in silence. And they expose the disturbing truth that history's official record is only the visible surface, while the submerged reality has been concealed for decades. The theme is simple and yet unbearable. 4 World War II secrets history tried to wipe away. What you are about to hear does not come from speculation or myth. It comes from the very words of memoranda, the faded ink of cables, and the hidden testimonies of those abandoned. Each file reopened in this series carries the weight of betrayal, the gravity of suppressed evidence, and the sense that if these truths had surfaced earlier, the story of victory would not be told in the same way. Enter now into the long-buried corridors of the forbidden record. Chapter 1. Classified Deal Behind Churchill's Silence. The winter of 1943 was bitter, both in climate and in politics. Snow fell heavily across London, blanketing the city in silence, while beneath Whitehall's stone corridors, the machinery of war hummed relentlessly. The Allied victory was not yet secured, but the shape of the post-war world was already being carved out, far from the battlefields. In files long sealed and stamped most secret, we find the outline of a deal that betrayed thousands. It is a story written in telegrams, conference notes, and coded exchanges between London, Washington, and Moscow. It is the story of Operation Keelhaul, a program that condemned men and women who had risked everything to fight fascism into the hands of another tyranny. By late 1943, the Allies faced a dilemma. Stalin demanded not only military support, but political concessions. His armies were absorbing unimaginable losses on the Eastern Front, and in exchange, he pressed for recognition of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. The price would be high. According to British War Office memoranda, Churchill himself scribbled marginal notes on draft agreements, weighing the burden of maintaining fragile unity against the cost of human displacement. The men and women at the heart of these documents were not politicians, but ordinary soldiers, prisoners, and displaced refugees from the Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. Many had fought with or supplied British agents of the Special Operations Executive. To them, the defeat of Germany meant freedom. To the Allied negotiators, it meant bargaining chips. In January 1944, a cable sent from the British Embassy in Moscow to the Foreign Office carried the subject line, "Repatriation of Soviet Nationals." Its language was clinical, bureaucratic, and chilling. His Majesty's government concurs in principle with Marshal Stalin's insistence upon the return of all Soviet citizens, regardless of circumstance. Behind that phrase lay countless stories of resistance fighters who had fled across enemy lines, men captured in Wehrmacht uniforms who had joined not by choice but by coercion, and families who had fled advancing Soviet troops out of fear. To Stalin, they were deserters and traitors. To Churchill, they were expendable in the calculus of alliance. Operation Keelhaul was not one event but a series of transfers spanning from 1944 through 1947. Declassified US Army records show that, under the cover of demobilization, Allied troops rounded up thousands of men, women, and children and delivered them to Soviet authorities. In Austria's Judenburg, British forces guarded trainloads of refugees who screamed as NKVD agents herded them into cattle cars. Witnesses recall British officers turning their backs, their faces pale, their orders clear, no interference. In Italy, Cossack units who had fought alongside German forces but sought surrender to the British were instead forcibly repatriated. Diaries recovered decades later describe suicides by families who refused to be handed over. Churchill's role was not passive. At the Tehran Conference of 1943, and again at Yalta in 1945, he personally endorsed the principle of forced repatriation. Minutes from those meetings, released only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, record his words, "We cannot afford division now. These matters must be settled with firmness." To him, alliance unity outweighed humanitarian pleas. To the victims, it was betrayal of the highest order. And yet, in public speeches, Churchill spoke of freedom, democracy, and the liberation of Europe, never once acknowledging the darker arrangements signed behind closed doors. The United States, too, bears responsibility. OSS documents reveal that American intelligence valued Soviet cooperation in dismantling the remnants of the Third Reich, and so they chose silence. General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters issued instructions to comply with repatriation demands, classifying dissenting reports from field officers who objected. Some commanders described the process as legalized kidnapping. Their words were struck from official records, filed under restricted categories, and in many cases destroyed. What survived are fragments, carbon copies hidden by clerks, diary entries smuggled to the West, testimonies taken in secret decades later. Why was this operation buried so thoroughly? The answer lies in the fragile post-war narrative. The Allies emerged as liberators, as defenders of human dignity against tyranny. To admit that they delivered thousands into Soviet camps would fracture that story. Propaganda films of liberated cities, of soldiers distributing chocolate to children, could not coexist with photographs of barbed wire transports heading east, and so the documents were sealed, stamped, and in many cases marked for destruction. The British Public Records Office received instructions to withhold relevant files until the year 2050 or beyond, citing reasons of public order and international stability, but the silence could not last forever. In the 1970s, fragments of the truth emerged when surviving émigrés told their stories to journalists and historians. Testimonies described British soldiers breaking down in tears as they followed orders to hand over Cossack officers, Polish partisans, and Ukrainian refugees. Some officers later confessed that they felt complicit in crimes against humanity, but their careers, and in some cases their freedom, depended on silence. The Cold War further complicated matters. Western governments were unwilling to publicize betrayals that could erode support for NATO, especially while confronting Soviet propaganda. Thus, the story of Operation Keelhaul remained a whispered rumor, half forgotten, until archives slowly opened after 1991. The figures remain staggering. Historians estimate that between 2 and 3 million individuals were forcibly repatriated under Allied oversight. Many perished in transit. Many more disappeared into Soviet prisons and labor camps. Families were split, resistance fighters executed, intellectuals purged, and yet the official histories of the Second World War, volumes published by government commissions, rarely mention these transfers. They prefer to speak of victory, of liberation, of the dawn of peace. The silence itself became part of the crime. When one reads the surviving files, the bureaucratic detachment is perhaps the most haunting. A War Office memorandum dated March 1945 describes the logistical requirement of rail transport for the processing of displaced persons, as though human beings were mere cargo. Another notes the necessity of firm handling to avoid disorder, referring to scenes where desperate prisoners clung to Allied trucks, begging for mercy. The language conceals the screams, the blood, the suicides that occurred as people realized they were being delivered to Stalin's secret police. The silence in the documents is deafening, yet between the lines the truth breathes. Churchill's defenders argue that he faced impossible choices. The alliance with Stalin was fragile. The invasion of Normandy required Soviet cooperation, and the entire balance of victory depended on maintaining trust. To defy Stalin's demands could have shattered the coalition and prolonged the war. Perhaps that is true. Yet the moral cost was hidden from the public, and those who paid it were denied recognition even in death. Their graves are unmarked, their names erased from the monuments of victory. What remains is this: the evidence of a deal that history tried to wipe away, and the knowledge that silence was chosen over truth. The file is thick with reports, stamped repeatedly with red ink, crossed out, and marked for restricted circulation. On the final page, a handwritten note in Churchill's own hand stands out. It reads, "Terrible but necessary. History must judge kindly." The words are as chilling as they are revealing, for history cannot judge kindly what it was never allowed to see. The erasure was deliberate, the silence cultivated, but the record survives, and with it, the truth. That liberation was shadowed by betrayal, and freedom was rationed at the price of silence. Chapter 2: Forbidden Experiments in Nazi Bunkers. The liberation of Dachau in April 1945 is remembered in photographs of emaciated survivors, of barbed wire torn down, of US soldiers confronting the horror of the camps. Yet the official liberation story obscures a darker truth. Beneath the ruins of the concentration camp, sealed rooms and hidden laboratories bore evidence not only of Nazi brutality, but of Allied complicity. Newly declassified US Army and British intelligence files reveal that Dachau was not simply a place of death. It was also a laboratory, a living catalogue of human suffering. What is most disturbing is not only what the SS doctors did, but what Allied intelligence chose to observe, record, and preserve, even at the cost of prolonging atrocities. Dachau's medical experiments had begun years earlier, under the supervision of SS doctors such as Sigmund Rascher. Prisoners were strapped into freezing water tanks to study hypothermia. Others were placed in low-pressure chambers that simulated altitudes above 60,000 feet until their lungs collapsed and their blood vessels ruptured. Still more were injected with chemical agents disguised as vaccinations, while SS guards recorded the effects. The Reich's goal was military: to harden its airmen, to improve survival at sea, to test new drugs. But when Allied intelligence learned of these experiments, their reaction was not outrage alone. Documents recovered from the US Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, show that American and British agents saw the data as invaluable. A cable marked "Restricted, Eyes Only," dated January 1945, references ongoing experiments at Dachau. The wording is clinical. Field agents confirm continuation of altitude and hypothermia trials. Recommend observation maintained until conclusion. Data projected to hold significant military application. In other words, Allied intelligence knew what was happening and chose not to intervene, in the hope of capturing unfiltered scientific knowledge at war's end. Photographs within the same file show skeletal men strapped into machinery, their faces contorted in agony. In some images, civilian-dressed observers stand nearby, not SS uniforms, but men with diplomatic immunity and neutral papers. They were not rescuers, they were watchers. The justification was always military necessity. With the war's outcome still uncertain in 1944, Allied planners believed that understanding hypothermia could save thousands of pilots downed in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. High-altitude tests, though fatal to the prisoners, promised insights into aviation medicine at the dawn of the jet age. Chemical trials, though monstrous, offered glimpses into new vaccines. The files show that intelligence officers catalogued the experiments meticulously, with reports filed under the heading "Special Medical Materials." In the logic of total war, human lives became raw data, stripped of identity, recorded in tables and charts. The men and women reduced to entries on paper were rarely named. They were simply Subject 72, Case 14, Specimen. After Dachau was liberated, American and British forces seized not only the camp but the laboratories. Crates of documents, vials of chemicals, and even surviving experimental apparatus were shipped back under Operation Alsos, a scientific intelligence mission tasked with capturing enemy research. The official narrative describes Alsos as a program to prevent Nazi technology from falling into Soviet hands. The hidden files, however, reveal another motive: to appropriate the results of human experimentation before the evidence could be destroyed. Reports show that American Army doctors debated whether to use the Dachau data for Cold War research. One memorandum, dated August 1946, states, "Though tainted by methodology, the findings represent unique information not replicable under controlled Allied conditions." In other words, they could not ethically reproduce the experiments, so they chose to exploit the Nazi data instead. The link to Operation Paperclip, the covert program that smuggled Nazi scientists into American laboratories, is undeniable. While the world saw trials at Nuremberg, with a handful of doctors condemned for war crimes, many others were quietly spared. Men who had overseen experiments at Dachau and elsewhere found themselves in the United States, working for the US Air Force, NASA, and pharmaceutical companies. Their pasts were scrubbed, their files sanitized. The very knowledge bought with human suffering became the foundation of Cold War medicine and technology. British intelligence followed a similar path, transferring select Nazi researchers into the United Kingdom under classified arrangements. The story of liberation was rewritten to omit these partnerships. Survivor testimony fills the gaps the documents conceal. Prisoners recalled being led into icy tanks, their bodies convulsing while men in lab coats took notes. Others remembered injections that left their veins burning, their fevers climbing, their bodies wasting away. Some described strange men with foreign accents observing in silence, never intervening. These witnesses insisted that liberation did not feel like a sudden rescue, but rather the quiet disappearance of one set of masters and the arrival of another, equally interested in what the human experiments had produced. Their voices were long ignored, dismissed as exaggeration, until the declassification of files confirmed their accounts. The Dachau files also reveal a deliberate cover-up after the war. When American prosecutors at the Nuremberg doctors' trial confronted the question of the medical data, they faced a dilemma. To admit that Allied forces were using Nazi research would undermine the moral authority of the trials. To discard the data entirely would mean losing information they deemed militarily valuable. Their solution was silence. Evidence of Allied observation was classified, excluded from trial proceedings, and marked for restricted circulation. The narrative of the Nuremberg trials presented Nazi medicine as barbaric and utterly rejected, while in the shadows, the data was quietly archived and in some cases, applied. The ethical consequences remain unresolved. Medical textbooks in the 1950s and 1960s referenced high-altitude and hypothermia data without attribution. NASA's early spaceflight programs relied on findings that mirrored Dachau's pressure chamber experiments. In Britain, pharmaceutical trials in the 1950s drew on methods strikingly similar to those tested in Nazi bunkers. The victims had died, but their suffering lived on in research conducted without their consent. Their identities erased while their agony became a resource. Perhaps the most haunting element is how ordinary the documents appear. Typed memoranda, standard carbon copies, neatly stapled reports. They look like administrative paperwork, but between their lines lies a crime against humanity. The bureaucratic tone is chilling. Subject expired after 23 minutes immersion. Pressure chamber produced fatal embolism at altitude equivalent 67,000 feet. No emotion, no horror, only data, and always, the observers, silent, waiting for the war to end so they could claim their prize. The story of Dachau's forbidden experiments is not only about the crimes of the SS, it is also about the choices made by those who claim to fight for freedom, choices to look away, to wait, to benefit. These files were not meant to surface. They were marked to remain buried because their existence undermines the clean narrative of good versus evil. Yet the paper trail endures, blacked out in places, incomplete in others, but unmistakable. Liberation came, but the victims of Dachau's laboratories were not freed. They were consumed twice, first by the Reich's science, and then by the silence of those who inherited its results. This is the forbidden chapter of Dachau, a place remembered as liberated, but in truth, a bunker of suffering whose secrets were carried into the Cold War. The legacy is one of betrayal, not only by those in black uniforms, but also by those in plain suits who chose knowledge over humanity and silence over truth. Chapter 3. Disturbing Truth of the Yalta Bargain. The image of three men sitting side by side at Yalta has been printed in countless history books. Franklin Roosevelt, frail and pale, cloaked in a blanket against the Crimean chill. Winston Churchill, cigar in hand, his hat tilted forward. Joseph Stalin, unsmiling, dressed in his marshal's uniform, his eyes unblinking. The photograph is remembered as a symbol of Allied unity, a portrait of power deciding the future of the world. But behind the camera lens, beyond the public statements of peace and cooperation, a very different set of negotiations unfolded. Classified notes from the Yalta Conference of February 1945 reveal that what was presented as victory diplomacy was, in truth, a bargain with devastating consequences. It was not liberation that was promised for millions of Europeans. It was transfer, partition, and silence. The Allied leaders arrived in Yalta knowing that Germany's defeat was near. Soviet troops were already deep inside Poland, and Red Army divisions were pushing steadily toward Berlin. The Western Allies needed Stalin's commitment to join the war against Japan, and they needed Soviet cooperation to secure the fragile peace in Europe. That urgency became the pressure point. In private sessions, the language of liberation gave way to the language of spheres of influence. Declassified memoranda described the tone of the meetings as coldly transactional. While the public was told that Europe would be free, the secret minutes make clear that vast populations were written off as bargaining chips in a global game. The case of Poland is the most telling. British and American intelligence had already received reports of the Katyn massacre, the mass execution of Polish officers by Soviet security forces in 1940. Yet at Yalta, when Polish sovereignty was discussed, those reports were deliberately suppressed. Churchill, who privately called the massacre monstrous, chose not to confront Stalin with the evidence. Instead, he and Roosevelt accepted a compromise that left Poland under Soviet control, with promises of free elections that would never truly occur. The Polish government in exile, based in London, was excluded from the final arrangements. Secret Foreign Office cables show that British diplomats anticipated that Soviet retribution against Polish resistance fighters would follow. They recorded their concerns in dry, coded phrases. A degree of civilian displacement should be expected. What those words meant, in practice, was deportation, execution, and imprisonment. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, fared no better. In a meeting recorded by Soviet stenographers, Stalin bluntly declared that their incorporation into the Soviet Union was non-negotiable. Churchill and Roosevelt did not contest the point. For decades, official histories describe this as a matter beyond Allied control. But declassified British War Cabinet notes tell a different story. The decision was not beyond control. It was simply conceded. The Western Allies decided that the Baltic states could not be saved without risking confrontation with the Soviet Union, and so their independence was quietly erased. The language in the records is strikingly detached. We cannot wage war against our ally for the sake of small nations. In those words, the principle of self-determination was sacrificed. Perhaps most disturbing are the documents that describe population transfers. Stalin demanded the right to secure his western borderlands by displacing what he considered hostile ethnic groups. Yalta's secret appendices mention population resettlements in the interest of security. Historians now know this referred to the forced movement of millions of Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, and others across new borders. Entire towns were uprooted. Trains were packed with families clutching what little they could carry. Many died en route from starvation, cold, or violence. Yet the Allies accepted these displacements as an unfortunate necessity, sealing the agreement without public debate. The minutes of Roosevelt's private discussions with Stalin are especially haunting. The American president, already gravely ill, sought Soviet support for the creation of the United Nations. In exchange, he conceded far more than the public ever knew. Declassified US State Department notes include one line that stands out. The president believes the United States cannot oppose Soviet designs in Eastern Europe at this time. With that sentence, Roosevelt effectively recognized Soviet dominance of half the continent. Churchill, though wary, went along. In his private diary, he described feeling compelled by circumstance to yield. Later in his memoirs, he would call Yalta the high tide of alliance. But the unpublished notes in his own hand tell a darker story. We have handed them the keys. Why were these decisions hidden for so long? The answer lies in the need to maintain the myth of victory. The Second World War was sold to the public as a war for freedom. To admit that millions of Europeans were consigned to dictatorship at the very moment of liberation would have shattered that narrative. The British Foreign Office classified the most incriminating Yalta files for 50 years, citing risks to international relations. The US government did the same, sealing Roosevelt's private papers under restricted access. Even when fragments leaked, officials dismissed them as misinterpretations. The truth was not denied outright. It was buried under silence and delay. The consequences of Yalta were immediate. In the months that followed, Soviet security forces moved swiftly to consolidate control. The NKVD hunted down members of resistance movements in Poland, the Baltic states, and Czechoslovakia. Many were executed, others deported to Siberia. Western intelligence received reports of these purges, but they were filed away as sensitive and not released to the public. For the victims, there was no rescue. The Allied leaders had already signed away their fate in a Crimean palace overlooking the Black Sea. The Cold War narrative that followed presented Yalta as the beginning of division, but the official histories softened its edges. They emphasized the necessity of alliance, the inevitability of compromise. Only with the gradual release of classified documents in the 1970s and 1980s did the disturbing truth emerge. The so-called free elections in Eastern Europe never materialized. The Iron Curtain descended, not by accident, but by design, by agreement, sealed at Yalta. The most haunting element of the Yalta bargain is its tone of inevitability. The documents show no dramatic confrontation, no anguished debate. Instead, they reveal cold calculations, the acceptance of sacrifice as though human lives were figures on a ledger. "We cannot save all," one British diplomat wrote in February 1945. "We must choose what is possible." In that choice, millions lost their freedom, their nations absorbed into an empire of silence. Today, the photograph of the Big Three at Yalta is still displayed in museums, a symbol of Allied cooperation. But the files behind the image tell another story. They speak of suppressed reports, concealed massacres, and agreements never revealed to the public. They expose a bargain that was less about peace than about partition, less about liberation than about control. The disturbing truth of the Yalta bargain is this: victory was not shared equally. For millions, the war ended not with freedom, but with a new chain of oppression, sanctioned by the very leaders who spoke of democracy. The record, once sealed, now speaks. And what it reveals is not triumph, but betrayal. A bargain too disturbing to be admitted until decades after the fact, when the victims had long since vanished into silence. Chapter 4: Hidden Soviet Advance into Berlin. Berlin, April 1945. The city was in ruins, its streets reduced to rubble, its population exhausted by months of bombing, hunger, and despair. The Red Army was closing in from the east, the Western Allies pressing from the west, and the German Reich was collapsing under its own weight. In the official histories, the storming of Berlin is remembered as the Soviet Union's crowning triumph, a decisive blow that ended the European war. But the files that remained hidden for decades tell a much darker story. They reveal not only the scale of destruction unleashed by the Red Army, but also the knowledge and the silence of the Western Allies who allowed it to happen. Declassified reports from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAF, describe the fall of Berlin in chilling detail. Field intelligence officers recorded mass executions carried out by Soviet troops, entire neighborhoods emptied of civilians, and systematic assaults committed against women and children. In one cable dated May 2, 1945, an American officer wrote, "The level of brutality defies report. Civilians reduced to prey, discipline non-existent." Yet those reports never reached the newspapers or the victory speeches. They were filed under sensitive, restricted distribution, sealed away as the West sought to maintain the illusion of Allied unity. Churchill knew of the atrocities. In late April, as Soviet divisions poured into Berlin, British intelligence delivered cables warning of civilian massacres. His response was to accelerate planning for what became known as Operation Unthinkable, a proposed Anglo-American strike against the Soviet Union to drive them out of Eastern Europe. The plan, dated May 22, 1945, envisioned redeploying British and American forces against their recent allies, but it was never carried out. The United States refused, unwilling to risk a new war so soon after victory. Berlin was left in Soviet hands, and its people were left to endure the consequences. Eyewitness accounts, smuggled out by surviving German civilians, paint a harrowing picture. Families huddled in cellars as Soviet artillery pounded the city. When the shells ceased, soldiers poured in, dragging women into the streets, stripping homes of valuables, and executing men accused of collaboration. Hospitals were raided, their wounded dragged away. Churches offered no sanctuary. The NKVD arrived swiftly, compiling lists of scientists, engineers, and officials. Many were whisked away to the Soviet Union under guard, never to be seen again. Others were forced into service, compelled to rebuild a city that no longer belonged to them. For Berliners, the arrival of liberation felt indistinguishable from conquest. Western leaders chose silence. Roosevelt had died only weeks earlier, leaving Harry Truman to inherit the fragile alliance. His administration concluded that exposing Soviet atrocities would rupture relations before the war in the Pacific was won. Official press releases instead emphasized cooperation, portraying the Red Army as heroic liberators who had sacrificed to break Hitler's power. The photographs chosen for public display showed Soviet flags raised above the Reichstag, soldiers embracing children, and the city reclaimed from fascism. What they did not show were the ruins filled with bodies, the terrified civilians lining up before NKVD checkpoints, or the trainloads of deportees heading east. The Soviet archives, too, erased the evidence. Reports of indiscipline and violence by Red Army troops were censored or rewritten. Stalin himself ordered strict control over the narrative of Berlin's fall. Soviet newsreels depicted a city joyfully liberated, its people cheering their rescuers. The reality, recorded in private letters and suppressed testimonies, was one of terror. Soviet soldiers wrote home about spoils of war, about punishment for the German people. Those letters were often intercepted, but some survived hidden for decades, a counterpoint to the official myth. The scientific plunder of Berlin remains one of the most carefully hidden chapters. Declassified US documents reveal that Soviet forces moved quickly to seize advanced research laboratories, weapons prototypes, and leading scientists. Rocket engineers who had worked on the V2 program were captured and transported to the Soviet Union. Entire factories were dismantled and shipped east. When US and British forces finally entered the western sectors of Berlin, they found little left. The Soviets had already stripped much of what was valuable. This scientific exodus laid the foundation for the Soviet Union's missile and space programs, achievements built upon the ruins of Berlin's captivity. The suffering of civilians during those weeks is difficult to measure. Historians estimate that in Berlin alone, tens of thousands were executed or died of violence in the final days of April and the early weeks of May. The number of women assaulted is far higher, a scale so vast it cannot be reduced to statistics without losing its human weight. Diaries recovered from survivors describe a city where night brought terror, where children were hidden in cupboards to protect them, where silence was mistaken for safety until boots echoed in the stairwells. These voices, ignored for decades, form the truest record of what Berlin endured. The Western Allies' silence was not accidental. It was calculated. US and British leaders feared that exposing the Soviet crimes would fracture the post-war order before it could even be built. They believed stability required unity, even if it meant burying the truth. The cost of that decision was borne by the people of Berlin, who were left voiceless as their suffering was erased from the official record. The public image of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag became a symbol of victory, while the shadows behind it were sealed in classified files. When those files were finally opened decades later, the story they told was unrecognizable from the one taught in schools. Reports of atrocities, intercepted letters and suppressed diaries revealed a Berlin not liberated but ravaged. Operation Unthinkable's existence confirmed that Churchill himself had contemplated war against the Soviet Union, knowing full well what was happening in the city. Yet the choice had been made: silence, unity, and myth over confrontation. The price of that choice was millions living under occupation, their suffering dismissed as the necessary cost of victory. The hidden Soviet advance into Berlin was not only a military triumph, it was a human catastrophe, concealed by both East and West. It remains one of the most disturbing examples of how truth can be sacrificed to preserve an alliance, how the suffering of civilians can be erased to maintain the image of victory. Berlin fell, but its story was rewritten. Only now, through the declassified files and the voices of survivors, can we hear what really happened in those final, terrible days of the war. And what we hear is not liberation, but silence, conquest, and a truth history tried to wipe away. The Second World War ended in triumph, but also in silence. The monuments, the photographs, and the speeches told one story, while the sealed files told another. Buried in archives for decades were the records of betrayal, the memoranda of compromise, and the reports of atrocities never meant for the public eye. Operation Keelhaul showed how allies were abandoned in the name of political unity. The experiments in Nazi bunkers revealed knowledge harvested from human agony, observed and then hidden by those who claimed to be liberators. The Yalta bargain exposed how the promises of freedom were quietly rewritten into maps of control and division. And the fall of Berlin demonstrated that liberation can conceal conquest when silence is chosen over truth. These four secrets are not isolated scandals. They form a pattern, a reminder that history, as written, is never whole. What lies beneath the official record is often darker, heavier, and too dangerous for comfortable memory. Even now, many files remain sealed, many testimonies still buried. What else has been erased? What truths lie waiting for another half-century, locked behind red stamps and missing pages? The war is over, but the silence it created still lingers, daring us to look deeper.